Now, transport systems in plants are less elaborate than in mammals, and this is because plants are less active than mammals. They are rooted into the ground, and they do not move other than their leaves because of the wind, transport like that. So they don't move around as much as mammals, so their system of transport does not have to be as elaborate. Now trees, like the one in the picture here, trees and other plants have branching shapes, and they have several branches and kind of allows them to allow their cells to get all the oxygen and carbon dioxide directly to and from the air by diffusion. So again, unlike mammals, plants are able to absorb and get oxygen and carbon dioxide directly to and from the air because of diffusion. Now, plants have two transport systems. They have xylem vessels and they have phloem tubes. And these can be found throughout the plant, but right now let's just focus on stems. Now, previously, we talked a little bit about the three main tissue systems that are found in plants. So let's take a review real quick. The three main tissue systems involve dermal tissue, vascular tissue, and ground tissue. So dermal tissue is the protective outer covering of plants. Now, when you take a leaf, for example, it has a protective outer covering, and that is the dermal tissue. Dermal tissue can also be found inside the plants as well, protecting other parts of the plant. Vascular tissue is the second main tissue system. Vascular tissue supports the plants and also transports needed water and nutrients throughout the plant. And as I just mentioned, xylem and phloem are part of this vascular tissue system. The third main tissue system in plants is ground tissue. Ground tissue produces and stores sugars and also helps support the plant. Now please understand that stem functions, or the functions of stems, include holding leaves up to the sun and transporting substances throughout the plant. So stems are very, very important for plants because they hold leaves up to the sun, allows that diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and helps transport substances throughout the plant. Now, particularly in stems, let's focus on the three main tissue types and see exactly where these tissue types are found in the stems. So, first let's talk about dermal tissue. Now, epidermal cells have very thick cell walls and waxy protective coatings. So if you see in this picture here, we can talk about our dermal tissue as being this outside layer of these tissues. Now this epidermal cells, remember, have very thick cell walls, and they're going to protect the outside of the plant from external issues. We also have ground tissue, and the ground tissue in stems are mainly made of cells called parenchyma, and these parenchyma cells are encased in epidermal cells. So if we're looking at the cells here, you can see that all this inside stuff, all of this layers, these are all considered to be ground tissue. Now in dicots, this ground tissue is called pith, and that's what you see in this picture over here on the right. It's all of this stuff that's inside here. That's all ground tissue. Now the vascular tissue, again, as I mentioned earlier, these are your xylem and phloem. Now in monocots, the picture here over on the right, on the left, monocots have vascular bundles that are scattered throughout the ground tissue. If you notice these little bluer little dots, this is your ground tissue. This is your vascular tissue. Now the vascular tissue is made up of the xylem and phloem. But if you notice over here on the right, we have the dicot. Now in dicots, the vascular tissue is actually surrounded like a ring pattern. So you see the difference between a monocot, which is all over the place, like the picture on the left, versus the right picture, which is the dicot. They're organized in ring-like patterns. So you can see the difference between this monocot and this dicot, or just different kinds of plants. But remember, the dermal tissue is located on the outside. This is your epidermis. Your ground tissue is located inside, and that's what's located here in these pictures here. That's kind of like your grayish material. And then your vascular tissue, or your xylem and phloem bundles. In dicots, they're located in a ring-like pattern. And in monocots, they're located all around. Now these vascular bundles are just groups of xylem and phloem tubes. Now, what are xylem and phloem tubes? Well, xylem and phloem helps transport water and nutrients throughout the plant. Now, xylem and phloem, both while they transport different things up through the plants. So let's take a look to see what exactly the difference is between xylem and phloem. Now, xylem vessels, these are the transport system in plants that carries water and minerals throughout the plant. So think of xylem as carrying the water. Now if you take a look at this picture, and you also have one in your notes, these are just made up of hollow, dead cells that are joined from end to end. So here, this, let me get a pointer out. So this little guy here, this is one cell, and it's attached to this cell right here, which is attached to this cell, and it continues on and on. Now these are dead cells, which means that they do not have nuclei. There is no cytoplasm, but instead the cell wall remains, and this cell wall is made up of very, very thick cellulose and lignin. Now these are two very strong materials that help keep the plant upright. Now the end walls, or basically the walls that are connecting these two cells, have disappeared, which now allows it to have this really long open tube, which allows water to flow through. Think of bamboo or straws. So these are where you have long, like all these dead cells attached to each other. Very strong cell walls remain, but allows things to flow through it. Now phloem tubes is part of the transport system, or part of this vascular bundle, that transports organic nutrients. Now these are the things that the plant has already made. So for example, some of the glucose and sucrose that the plant needs from one end to another moves up through the phloem. Now once again, the phloem is connected with various cells that are joined end to end. However, you notice here these end walls, basically the plates that go between the two cells, these have not fully broken down. They are still visible. And instead they form these things called sieve plates or sieve tubes. So imagine these little holes that allow things to transport themselves back and forth. Now these sieve tubes contain cytoplasm, but they do not have nuclei. They also do not have lignin in the cell walls, like the xylem does. The xylem have those lignin cells. Sieve tubes have companion cells as well. These companion cells do have a nucleus. So if you take a look over here, right next to these sieve tubes, is a companion cell. Now it's thought that these companion cells, which do have a nucleus, supply the sieve tubes with nutrients. So while these things are just cells from end to end with no nucleus, these companion cells help keep these things sort of alive in order to help move things from one end to the other. Now overall, if you take a look at a tree also has a stem, but we call that the trunk, basically. The trunk of the tree, but it's just a huge stem. So taking a look at this picture, you'll notice that there's several components of the stem of a tree. Now in some cases, we can see, with thicker trees, we can see lots of xylem, sometimes active xylem, sometimes, more likely than not, what we're looking at are the former xylem. So as the tree grows, new xylem forms. We also have the xylem here, which is called heartwood. That's the inside stuff. That's the stuff that's old xylem. It no longer conducts any fluid, but it still helps act as support for that tree. We also have cork, and we have cork cambium, and we have phloem. Now these things make up the bark. So when we're looking at the outside of a tree, we do see bark a lot of times and we want to peel it off. But this is actually very important stuff because you can tap into the phloem of a tree if you go too deep into it. So if you take all the bark off and you're actually tapping into the phloem, and remember that phloem is very important to transport the sugars up the tree or down the tree, wherever it basically needs some sugar. The cork and the cork cambium, now these are basically, the cork is the old phloem, and the cork cambium is a layer of tissue that protects the cork or protects the tree. So if you dig too deep, you're getting into that phloem, which could damage the tree. Now we also have this vascular cambium here. And again, this stuff actually produces new xylem and phloem. And it helps create new stem width, so it actually makes the tree bigger. So if we're looking at normal plants, just your regular green stuff that's outside, your stems of plants have xylem and phloem. They have protective coverings, epidermal tissue or dermal tissue. And trees themselves have a little bit more. They have the old xylem. They have the new xylem as well. That contains the wood. And then you have the bark, and that's either the old phloem or the current phloem with some layers of protection in between.